As we head into a summer that might involve the prosecution of a former president. Today is the anniversary of what turned out to be the beginning of the end of another presidency, Richard Nixon's. 50 years ago today, a break-in at the DNC's headquarters here in Washington, D.C. at the Watergate Hotel led to one of the biggest political scandals in American history, and the legacy lives on. Our own Pete Williams went back to the Watergate building and back to where it all began.
Early in the morning, 50 years ago, these two men were Washington, D.C. police officers responding to a report of a break-in at the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. Walking through these very same halls, they didn't know what to expect.
Do I think we're on to something? Yes, but I have no idea how big it's going to be.
No idea that the arrest they made that night would lead to the discovery of a political scandal that ended with Richard Nixon becoming the only American president ever to leave office in the middle of his term.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Watergate changed the American political system and the very language of scandal. At first, it looked like a petty crime. 5 men arrested June 17, 1972, after breaking into the National Democratic Party headquarters. Paul Leeper and John Barrett responded to the police radio call while they were on regular duty as part of a plainclothes detail. A security guard at the Watergate office building called police after noticing that someone had used tape to prevent the stairwell doors from locking. With guns drawn, they searched room by room in the suite of Democratic offices, now occupied by a publishing company, until they came to a room of cubicles. Officer John Barrett suddenly saw an arm.
I yelled something to the effect, get your hands up, et cetera, expletive deleted, I'm sure. And Paul came in, jumped up on a desk, pointed his gun down, the 5 hands go up here.
This photo shows the actual desk the Watergate burglars hid behind. One of them was holding a raincoat and wouldn't drop it. Barrett feared it was hiding a gun.
He dropped the coat. He didn't have a gun in his hand, but it was precarious at that point. It was like really bad. I was almost getting ready to let a round go.
You're thinking this might be a burglary. So what do you think when you see 5 guys stand up in suits?
These guys all look like business people, so I'm thinking, is this some kind of international thing? That I
mean, like spies?
Yeah, well, I don't know really what I'm into. I know I'm in something big.
The White House at first called it a third-rate burglary. It soon became clear that something much bigger was involved, even though all these years later, it's never been firmly established who ordered the break-in or what the purpose was. But from the beginning, a big question was how high up did it go? As the scandal spread to Nixon's aides, he claimed he knew nothing. That defense soon began to unravel, in part based on facts uncovered by Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. A year later, the Senate opened its marathon Watergate hearings. A key witness, John Dean, the White House counsel, said Nixon knew about efforts to cover up the break-in.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
Then a spectacular discovery. Virtually all important Oval Office conversations were recorded on audio tape because President Nixon had ordered the installation of recorders.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history.
When a special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, pushed to get the tapes, Nixon wanted Cox fired. Both the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General refused to do it and quit in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Under an order from the Supreme Court, the White House eventually turned over the tapes in July 1974. After a House committee voted to impeach and key Republicans told Nixon they'd lost faith in him, the 37th President of the United States resigned and bid a tearful goodbye to his staff.
Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them.
Many of the president's top aides were convicted for their roles in the scandal. Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, gave him a full pardon. It all started with a routine police radio call and 2 very surprised policemen.
The thing just kept growing, in my mind. I'm thinking about every hour or so, my God, what are we involved with?
Pete Williams joins me now. Pete, ultimately, the end game for Richard Nixon was to find the weakest possible opponent for the 72.
And that was the whole dirty trick.
That was the whole thing. It turned out And what's interesting to me today, we were talking about this, is all of the scandals uncovered by Watergate, many of the things that we found scandalous back then are part of our everyday politics. I got 4 different campaigns that are trying to pick their primary opponent, getting involved in a campaign. They're doing it overtly rather than covertly. But what's striking to me is that the legacy of Watergate, in some ways, is you see it now in plain sight.
Is that anything goes in politics? Yeah, the goal was to force Muskie out.
Right.
And they did. They were successful in doing it. They sabotaged his campaign. They put out phony press releases, phony letters in his name. That was part of the dirty tricks thing. And, of course, the whole question here, it's so fascinating that 50 years later, after all the accounts, all the biographies, all the books, all the interviews, we still don't know the answer to 2 questions. Who ordered the break-in? Lots of theories about it. Right. And what was the point of it? Was it to plant a bug? Was it to take pictures? Was it to find what the Democrats had on Nixon that might be derogatory? Was it to look for derogatory things about the Democrats? Was it to protect certain aides of the White House? All these different
and you got to remember when it was, this is at the end of the primary season. We already knew now there was a question of who was going to be the nominee. And so we're at June, so they had... What it turned out, it was almost like they were finishing a job it turned out that they began months earlier.
Yeah. And, of course, all discovered because the security guard found that somebody had put tape on a door. He pulled the tape off, went to have lunch, came back, and the tape was back again. That's when he called the cops.
There's still one more mystery, the 19 minutes.
Oh, on the Rosemary.
Going to get the technology to actually... eventually find out
the archives has, this is on the Rosemary Woods tape.
Yeah.
The archives has tried several times to see if every time there's some advancement in technology, if they can find it, and they haven't.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.